On February 14, 2003, on the frozen peak of Alaska, three experienced mountaineers began a journey they believed was carefully prepared, yet within days, silence swallowed them whole. No signal, no trace, only a chilling void that left their families and friends with questions that time refused to answer. It was called a mysterious disappearance on the glacier, but the story did not end there. 20 years later, as the massive ice began to melt under the weight of a warming world, secrets long entombed slowly came to light. Scientists uncovered something no one could have imagined: bodies preserved almost perfectly, alongside a frozen journal, its last desperate words still etched in the pages. What really happened on that stormy night, and why could nature hide such a haunting truth for decades? The story you are about to hear will take you back to their final journey, a journey where a single mistake meant vanishing into the white abyss, only to be found when an entire lifetime had already passed. They had prepared for months, studying maps of the glacier, checking weather reports, gathering equipment that could withstand the cruelest storms. Their plan was precise, their spirits steady, and to those who knew them, it seemed impossible that anything could go wrong. The leader, Marcus Chen, was only 34, yet already considered a veteran in the world of icy frontiers. His research at the University of Colorado had given him both knowledge and confidence, and he dreamed of proving that even the most hostile environments could be understood through science. Alongside him were two companions, both skilled climbers, both bound by the same hunger for discovery and by a trust in Marcus that felt unshakable. In the last phone call to his family, Marcus had sounded calm, even cheerful, describing the mountain air as sharp and clean, promising to be back within weeks. No hint of fear in his voice. No sign that this would be the final words they would ever hear. They left the base camp in the early hours, the snow crunching beneath their boots, the glacier stretching before them like an endless sea of white, the wind already rising, carrying whispers that seemed to come from the mountain itself, whispers that warned but went unheard. By the second day, the weather shifted, clouds swallowed the sky, and the sun disappeared behind a curtain of gray. Their radios crackled with static, their visibility dropped to almost nothing. Still, they pressed forward, convinced that turning back was not an option. Search teams later found fragments of their trail, faint boot prints stamped into the ice, leading toward a ridge where the glacier split into jagged crevices, dangerous ground, where a single misstep could mean falling into darkness with no return. Near that point, a torn piece of fabric was discovered, frozen stiff, fluttering against the ice like a flag of surrender. But in 2003, it gave no answers, only more silence. What happened next can only be pieced together from the frozen journal that would surface 2 decades later, its final entries written in shaky hands, words interrupted by smudges of melting frost. In those pages, Marcus wrote of an approaching storm, stronger than anything they had faced before, winds so violent they could barely stand, snow so heavy it erased their footprints as quickly as they made them. He described the sound of ice cracking beneath them, deep and hollow, like the earth itself was opening its jaws. The journal ended suddenly, with a final unfinished sentence, a line that trailed off into nothing, as though the hand that wrote it had been pulled away mid-thought. Families waited for weeks, then months, clinging to the faint hope that somehow, against all odds, the three would emerge from the snow, exhausted but alive. Yet every rescue attempt ended the same, with helicopters searching blank expanses, dogs pacing restlessly on frozen ridges, and rescuers staring into a world of white where no clue could be trusted. Winter buried the mountain deeper, and by spring the glacier had sealed itself, as if it had chosen to guard its secrets, and so the search was called off, leaving behind unanswered questions, broken hearts, and an unspoken fear that the mountain had claimed them forever. Their final journey, their last climb, was swallowed by silence, leaving only fragments of memory behind, until 20 years later, the glacier itself began to speak. The alarm was raised within hours of their silence. Families at home grew restless when days passed with no word, and by the end of that first week, the authorities could no longer ignore the vanishing. Rescue teams assembled at the base of the glacier, men and women trained to fight the mountain, but even they knew the odds were shrinking with each passing hour. Helicopters sliced through the gray sky, their blades scattering snow in violent spirals, searchlights sweeping across endless fields of white, but nothing moved below, no figures waved back. No sign of life clung to the ice. From above, the mountain looked still, silent, almost mocking, as if it had swallowed the climbers whole and left no trace. On the ground, teams of rescuers trudged through snow that reached their knees, their breath clouding in the frozen air. Dogs barked, their paws raw against the ice, straining at leashes, then stopping, confused, as if they too could sense the futility of the mission. Every few hours, the rescuers paused to listen, hoping to hear a distant cry, a whistle, anything that might lead them forward, but the only answer was the endless roar of the wind. The first signs came days later. Faint boot prints pressed into hard ice, leading toward a ridge fractured by deep crevices, each step frozen in time, as though the mountain had preserved. Their last moments of choice, forward or back, life or death. Beside the trail, searchers found a glove, frozen stiff, its fabric torn at the seams, lying alone against the white. A reminder that someone had struggled, someone had fought against the cold, and lost. They pushed further, roping themselves together, inching across ice bridges that groaned under their weight, the abyss yawning beneath them like a mouth eager to consume. And still, there was no sign of the missing. Radios crackled with fragmented words, coordinates shouted into static, updates that carried no comfort, only the admission that nothing had been found. Nightfall brought new terror. The temperature plummeted, winds screamed like voices through the valleys, tents rattled violently, and more than once rescuers thought they heard footsteps outside, or the echo of human cries, only to find nothing when they emerged into the storm. The mountain played tricks on them, conjuring hope where none existed, feeding exhaustion, testing every ounce of resolve. Weeks passed, and the mission became one of endurance rather than rescue. The reality settling heavy on every heart, that survival after so long was impossible, that what they searched for was no longer the living, but the remains, hidden somewhere in the ice. Yet still they searched, unwilling to surrender the families to silence, unwilling to let the glacier's cruelty be the final answer. A helicopter crew spotted something on the 12th day, a patch of dark against the snow, and hearts raced. But when they landed, it was only a torn scrap of fabric, fluttering in the gale, mocking their hope. Another team reported a faint signal on their radio, a blip of static that sounded almost like a voice, but it never returned, vanishing as quickly as it came. The families arrived at the base camp in the third week, wrapped in heavy coats, their faces lined with grief and exhaustion. They stood by the fires, waiting for news, clutching photographs of their loved ones, whispering prayers into the frozen night. Some refused to leave, convinced that their sons, their husbands, their brothers would step out of the storm, frostbitten but alive, any moment now. Others wept silently, already mourning, already knowing. By the end of the month, the search teams had covered every ridge, every valley, every crevice they could reach, but the glacier remained indifferent, its secrets buried deep beneath walls of ice. And with heavy hearts, the rescue was called off. The mountain had won, its silence unbroken, its victims entombed in a frozen grave that no one could penetrate. All that remained were fragments, a glove, a strip of fabric, a trail of footprints that led into nothingness, and the memory of 3 men who had vanished into the white abyss, leaving their loved ones with a wound that time refused to heal. The families returned home, carrying their grief across decades. The world moved on, but the glacier held its silence, until 20 years later, when melting ice would finally give back what it had taken. For 2 decades, the glacier lay silent, a white monument to absence, untouched, unbroken, holding tight to its secrets, while families aged and the world forgot. The names of the missing slipped from headlines, their photographs faded on mantles, yet for those who had loved them, the wound never closed. Every storm that swept across the mountain was a cruel reminder, every winter another unanswered question. Then, almost 20 years later, the world began to change. Summers grew hotter, winters shorter, The once impenetrable glacier began to retreat, its vast walls of ice shrinking, cracking, sighing under the weight of a warming climate. For scientists, this was a crisis, but also an opportunity, a chance to study the hidden history preserved deep within the frozen heart of the mountain. In February, a small research team set out to document the glacier's rapid retreat, armed with drills, sensors, and cameras. They expected to find layers of ancient ice, perhaps pollen trapped from centuries past, maybe even frozen animals long extinct. What they discovered was something else entirely. On the 12th day of the expedition, one of the team noticed a dark shape breaking through the translucent wall of ice. At first, they thought it was rock, a jagged stone pulled forward by the shifting glacier. But as they drew closer, the outline sharpened, unmistakable, haunting. It was not stone, it was human. The body was perfectly preserved, curled in a position of exhaustion, the clothing still intact, the colors muted but visible, a backpack strapped tightly across frozen shoulders. Ice crystals glittered along the skin, like glass armor, sealing the figure in timeless silence. The scientists stood frozen themselves, staring through the blue haze of ice at a man who had vanished 2 decades ago, looking almost as if he had been asleep, waiting to be found. Over the next days, more shapes emerged, a second body, then a third, each encased in their own chamber of ice, their final resting place revealed by the slow surrender of the glacier. Alongside them were scattered belongings, a metal flask, a torn rope, and, most remarkably, a notebook, its cover stiffened by frost, its pages frozen together but still legible when carefully thawed. Forensic experts were called in, their task not just to recover, but to understand. The bodies, though lifeless for 20 years, bore little decay. The glacier had protected them, preserving their faces, their hands, even the watch on Marcus's wrist, forever frozen at the hour of their final struggle. Families were notified, their grief resurfacing like an old wound torn open again, but also, at last, tempered with the possibility of answers. The discovery shook the scientific community, proof that glaciers could guard the past for generations, then release it suddenly, like ghosts stepping out of the shadows. But for the families, and for the world that remembered the disappearance only dimly, it was not science that mattered. It was the faces that stared back from the ice, familiar, unchanged, and unbearably human. The mountain had given them back, 20 years too late. Yet not too late to tell their story. The frozen notebook became the key, a fragile bridge between silence and truth, its pages stuck together by layers of frost, but under careful hands they opened, revealing words that had waited 2 decades to be read. The handwriting was steady at first, Marcus describing the climb, the bitter wind, the way the glacier creaked and shifted beneath them. But as the entries continued, the script grew uneven, broken, as if each word had been written in haste, under unbearable strain. He spoke of the storm, a wall of white descending without warning, winds so violent they tore at tents, snow falling so thick it erased the world around them, visibility reduced to nothing. Each man reduced to a shadow stumbling through the blizzard. He wrote of the cold, a cold that sank into bone, into thought, numbing not just the body, but the will to continue. The final pages were darker still, lines scrawled in panic, sentences half finished, Marcus describing a sound beneath their feet, a deep crack echoing through the glacier, the ground trembling like a living thing, then silence, followed by the realization that they were standing above a crevasse. He wrote of one companion falling, a rope snapping, the darkness swallowing him whole, his voice lost to the storm. There were words of desperation too, apologies to family, notes of love written through tears, promises that if the ice preserved them, someday someone would understand. The very last entry ended mid-sentence, the pen's trail frozen across the page, as though ripped from his hand at the very instant of collapse. Scientists confirmed what the journal suggested. The 3 had been caught in a sudden blizzard, forced to move blindly across unstable ground, until one misstep opened the abyss, dragging them down. Their bodies had not fallen far, only enough to be sealed in by snow and ice, locked away by the glacier's slow, merciless advance. The forensic reports were chilling. The men had likely died quickly, their injuries severe but preserved with unnatural clarity, skin still pale, clothing stiff but intact. Every detail, a frozen testament to their final struggle. The objects recovered told their own story, a rope frayed and broken, an ice axe snapped in two, the metal flask dented, as though it had struck rock during the fall. For the families, the notebook was unbearable to read, yet it was also a gift, proof that in their last hours, the missing had thought of home, had left behind words that could outlast death. Some wept, some clutched the pages to their chest, whispering to the frozen voices as though they could still hear them across time. The world reacted with shock. Headlines spoke of the glacier's secret. Photographs of the preserved climbers circulated, eerie images of men who looked as if they could wake at any moment. Yet beyond the fascination, beyond the scientific wonder, there was only sorrow, the reminder that nature does not forgive, that time can hide but not erase. The glacier, once their grave, had become their witness, and in releasing them, it revealed not just the tragedy of 3 men, but the fragile truth of human ambition against the power of the earth. The glacier had hidden them for 20 years, and in the end, it gave them back. But what returned was not life, only the stillness of preservation, a reminder that time waits for no one, yet also that time never truly erases. For the families, there was grief, raw and fresh, as though the loss had happened yesterday, but there was also relief, the kind that comes only when silence is broken, when questions at last receive answers, no matter how painful. Mothers who had grown old finally touched the frozen hands of their sons. Wives who had long been widows traced the faces that had not aged a day. Tears fell freely, mixing with the melting ice. Funerals were held, simple, quiet, heavy with sorrow, yet marked by a strange peace. The bodies once locked in eternal winter were finally laid to rest in the warmth of the earth, beneath skies that no longer howled with storm, but instead carried the songs of mourning and memory. Friends and relatives spoke of their courage, their passion, their final climb, remembering not only how they died, but how they lived, the laughter, the dreams, the fire that had driven them into the mountains. Scientists continued to study the discovery, but for the families, the glacier was no longer a subject of research. It was sacred ground, a place where their loved ones had fought against nature and lost, a place that had held their memory like a frozen tomb. Some refused to ever return, unable to face the cold expanse again, while others chose to visit, to stand at the edge of the ice and whisper words into the wind. Words they wished had been spoken 20 years earlier. The story spread far beyond Alaska, capturing imaginations across the world, not just for the mystery, not just for the preservation, but for what it revealed about humanity, about how fragile we are, how determined, and how easily forgotten, if not for the persistence of those who love us. The mountain had claimed them, but it had also, in the end, returned them, as though acknowledging that even in death, they did not belong to the glacier, but to the people waiting at home. There is something haunting about the idea that the earth itself can hold secrets for decades, even centuries, only to reveal them when the time is right. It forces us to see our own lives differently, to understand that nothing is truly lost, not forever, not completely. That the stories of those who vanish remain written, somewhere, waiting to surface again. And so, as we leave this tale, we are reminded of the fragility of our steps. Every journey we take into the unknown carries a risk. Every adventure holds the weight of uncertainty, yet still, people climb, explore, and reach for the places that test the limits of human strength. Perhaps that is what keeps us alive, the will to go further, even knowing the cost. To those listening now, hold close the ones you love. Speak the words you may not get another chance to say, for the world is vast, unpredictable, and tomorrow is never promised. The glacier kept its silence for 20 years, but your silence, your distance, can last a lifetime if you do not bridge it. Remember them not only as the climbers who vanished, but as voices that echo through the ice, telling us that life is fleeting, fragile, and that every moment matters more than we ever realize. If stories like this move you, If you want to uncover more mysteries of those who vanished without a trace, don't forget to subscribe to Last Seen, where every disappearance finds its voice again.